today with me, I have Colin here. He is the Senior Director of SRM at Nestle in the USA, and he will talk more about building effective RGM organizations. I myself am the head of sales at Buynomics. I'm the moderator today, so I will be, posing your questions in the chat to Colin. But Colin, over to you. You're the main star of this webinar today. Introduce yourself, and then I think we'll kick off with the content, as I think now most people are dialed in.
Sounds good. Kyle, thank you for joining. My name is Colin McQuay. I lead our SRM group at Nestle USA. I've been with Nestle about 15 years. My background is kind of dual finance and this commercial analytics space. So I've done most of the what I'd call traditional finance experience roles, costing, factory work, P&L management, brand management, business building, etc. And then I spent a good chunk of time in this commercial analytics space, standing up pricing capabilities, thinking about promotional capabilities, etc. And for the last 3 years, I've been on this SRM group that has morphed into the team we are now in 2023.
Great. Thanks so much for being here as well, Colin. Super great to have experts like yourself. I think this is why we have people from all over the globe, actually. I'm seeing people from Belgium here, from London, US, France, Costa Rica, Switzerland. So quite a diverse group of people, and we'll learn more about them actually in the next few slides. But I'll hand over to you to explain a bit what Nestle does, and then also your RGM journey today.
Just by way of background, Nestle is obviously a global company. My team supports the US market. So if Nestle is about $100 billion globally, the North American division is about a third of that, and then the US market is the predominant piece of that North American market. We've had a crazy couple of years, just as I assume most of you have, multiple rounds of pricing, supply issues, return to promotion. How do you attack this new consumer space? We've had to navigate through all of that. And the way that my team supports our business is we have a 9 different operating divisions across the US. Think of as a division as one business unit of like products, like the beverage business unit. And with the way that Nestle works, the reason we get to that spot is we've been pretty acquisitive over the course of the last 10, 15 years, buying brands like the Starbucks CPG brand or the Essentia Waters brand. So as we bring them into part of the family, or into the family rather, part of our job is to help bring good RGM practices to those businesses.
Great. I also wanted to pose this question to the audience. We learned already that they're from a diverse set of countries, but I'm just going to launch a poll right now and see, because I think, Colin, we talked about this in our kind of pre-meetings. It really matters kind of where in the maturity stage you are in terms of how your journey looks like, but also what your organization is like, right? Are you a large cap firm like Nestle, or maybe you have a specialty in pancake mixes and you're only active in the US? That's a very different story. And I think we also wanted to learn a bit more about, okay, where are folks coming from today? So please fill that in. Also, if you're not from a large or any CPG and you're just interested, you see the poll on screen right now. You can also click not applicable if you are just a student interested in the topic. But let's see, I see 60% participation so far. I think we can get that up a bit higher. Want to have at least 70-80%. So everyone just kind of click on what your organization looks like. And we're almost at 70. I think we can do a bit better, but I'll end the poll now. And then I'll share the results with you also. Colin, can you see it?
Yes.
So as we expected a little bit, there's most people, I would say half, in really large companies, large enterprise with more than 10,000 people. And then there's a small amount of people in very small companies and so on and so forth. Is this surprising to you, Colin, given what we said about how many people work in RGM and that it's mainly a large cap thing, right?
Well, and look, maybe get into the punchline for a sec. The reason we're here is to talk about how do you do something like this? How do you stand up an RGM team, and how do you define that? How do you measure it, etc.? And I'll come to you today with some humility. There is not an answer to that question. I think that answer, so to speak, is really predicated on what organization you belong to. What is that organization's culture, structure, fit, etc. And so one of those dimensions is size. And so as you go through this next 30 minutes with me or us, I wouldn't take away, oh, go do this thing, go do that thing. I'll show you what's working for us. And I'll also show you the places I've stubbed my toes, banged my head against a wall, all the things. But I think really it's about understanding what good RGM looks like and then how it fits to your unique business, your model, your team, your structure. And so one of those components I think is size, frankly, and complexity of business underneath that size.
Yeah, yeah. Very fascinating. So let's dive right into it. I think the first slide that we have here, I'll let you narrate it, but it's basically about where you came from and where you'll be going. I think that's a great way to start.
Sure. Yeah. Just to give you guys a sense, right? At Nestle in the US, we've been doing pieces of this for a long time. We've had pricing analytics for a number of years, but they've lived in a specific space. We've had promotional analytics that have existed in certain pockets for a long time, but it's been in a different space. We've had brand teams that have thought about good pack discipline, thought about good mix discipline, but they've been in different places, pockets, and because, again, we have different operating businesses that operate somewhat differently, you end up with different levels of expertise and different levels of how you do this kind of stuff exist across the organization. And so in 2020, we made the decision as a company, we've got to go a little more towards this standard central big push model. And our central, we call it SRM, but it's RGM team, launched. And the model in 2020 was really simple. It was, if you're going to use a simple hashtag, it was hashtag enable others to do SRM. So it was just a handful of people. We opened this up on a 4 to 5 year plan to stand up centralized analytics, stand up centralized process, and stand up acumen building. How do you think about this broadly? And so what my job at the time was, amongst a small set of people, was to think about how I do that for the organization. So as a small example, we brought together the disparate pieces of pricing into one stream to say, if there is a need for analytics behind price, I have to take an action. What's it worth? You go to one place, you get one answer, and all that analytic horsepower is built into one solution for you. And we did that in several places, sped it up, brought higher horsepower analytics to the party, things like that. And we did that throughout 2021 and 2022. Again, development of analytics, process, and that enablement is the acumen build. How do you think about some of these concepts? Because as you guys all know, RGM at its core is really two things. It's the tools, analytics, process, but it's also the acumen build in your people, in yourselves, and in your organizational employees, the day-to-day folks that work, your leaders, etc. And we had good success there, and I'll explain a little bit more about kind of what we learned in those 2 years. But fast forward to this year, and we realized that that model was absolutely right to start. But to get where we wanted to go, which is not to be good or great at this, but to be really world-class, we had to make an evolution. And the evolution we made was to become a truly embedded function across the organization. So one of the limitations of the 2020, 2021, 2022 space was that people like me didn't have direct accountability to any single business. And frankly, part of the struggle, we didn't even know where to report. Through the course of those couple of years, I reported into our digital community, our finance community, our sales community. We didn't know. And so we settled on kind of, okay, how does this RGM thing need to live? How does it structure? And in those 3 years, I operated more like a consultant than anything else because I couldn't cover 7, 8, 9 different businesses. So I would fly in, fly out. It's a useful start, but it really is just a jump start. And so what we did in 23 was made that next evolution into the quote or hashtag do SRM. We still work on behalf of our business, and I'll get to some of the decision-making authority in a minute. But what we have now become is every one of our business units has dedicated people that do nothing but this, that support the business. And I think it's really helpful to kind of think about in your org, at least for us, we have lots of really smart folks that run our brands, that run our sales teams, that run our finance teams, et cetera. But they all have completely full jobs. And none of them is built to think about how do I drive good, healthy rate into my plan? What is the right pack structure for that? And so the real value add my folks provide is that That is their job. They are the one person or two people thinking about those things. And as they embed in the businesses, they have the same goals the business does: grow, drive profit, feel more consumer centricity, sustainability agenda, all those things, but do so with that RGM lens. And that's really the value we've begun to add. We just started that this year, and we're starting to put our feet on the ground around what that looks like as we think about moving forward to that world where RGM is just how we work. And so that's kind of the trajectory of our journey from beginning to where we are now and where we're going. Really fun, but I'll tell you, as you guys all know, you stub your toes, you crack your knuckles, you bang your head against walls, all in the service of making progress. But really at its core, this is changing how you work, how your teams work, and you got to be kind of up for that challenge.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. And I love that element of culture change and like do RGM that you mentioned there in passing. It's really, coming from such diverse backgrounds, because as you said, SRM might not have been a function, but it did exist in pockets of the enterprise, right? And getting those aligned does take a big transformational process. And I was just actually asking the chat here when they started their RGM function as such, and it seems like, and this is, I haven't counted this statistically, but a lot of people started around 2019, 2020. I'm seeing, some earlier with 2016, 2017 in there as well. Some are just starting right now, but it's quite interesting to see that the last 3 years seem to have really catalyzed that function. What is that? Why do you think RGM has become so important, especially in those recent 3 years?
Well, I'll speak for us. And I think, look, we've been, humble brag, Nestle's been quite successful for 150 years. But I think as you advance into the 2020s, pre-COVID, right? We didn't know anything about that when we started here. The stuff and the activities and the ways of working that got us here will not get us to the next 150. The market is moving too quickly. Consumers have too much visibility in a good way across channels and prices and the omni environment. All this stuff is just making us have to make decisions more quickly, integrate smart data into those decisions faster, and make different actions on a shorter timeline. And that just requires us to think differently. And so I think the muscles of building good rate driving practices, good revenue management into your business is essentially an imperative. And so we realized that in the 2010s and decided that by 2020 had to start making those activities and then evolve to how best to bring that to life. But at its core, I think we've realized that our Nestle US CEO talks all the time. The pace of change tomorrow will always be faster than today. And so as you think about that as a human being, the pace of change today will be the slowest it will ever be. And you kind of wrap your arms around that. You got to do these kinds of things.
Yeah, that's really fascinating and very true from where I stand as well. But we wanted to talk a little bit about kind of within that function. How has the role of RGM changed, and also how you measure success as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to give you a couple of the sort of forks in the road we decided around. And again, I'll preface humbly by saying, I think we've made the right decisions for us. They may not be the right decisions for you, but I wanted to give you a sense of what we weighed, why we chose what we did, and where we are across that journey. The two things at 30,000 feet we really had to wrap our arms around was, what is the role of our team? As you think about the spectrum of, are we going to make a bunch of decisions, i.e. who owns the decision to take a pricing action? All the way to the other side, which is we own no decisions. We are there as challengers. That was one sort of fork in the road. And the other was, how do we measure value, right? We've now said we have dedicated people, dedicated analytics groups. These have costs associated, or is it worth the cost? And how do you justify, so to speak, especially in the early days, that cost? On the one extreme, you've got the project tracking mechanism. All right, Colin, list the 42 initiatives you guys did, the value of each one, and let's make sure that number works. And by the way, every controller needs to make sure they've signed off that number is in their P&L. Okay, that you can start to see there's some real pros, but also some real challenges with that approach. And then on the other extreme, you get to this, what I call macro KPI world. Let's explain to the organization, when we're good at this, these two things will be true, and measure me there holistically. And you can start to see there's some real pros to that, but there's some real challenges there as well around, is that really us? Is it someone else? How does it work, et cetera? And so we wrestled with both of these, and we're still working through how we get to Bright. But as far as the decisions we've made, on the top, for us, again, and the model that we have built at Nestle USA is we don't want to own any of these decisions. We want to enable our strong GMs, our strong sales leaders, our strong finance leaders to make those decisions. So we play much more on the challenger side. That means my teams, we own a bunch of analytics, process, thought leadership, micro decisions, but around decisions in the marketplace for business strategy, we don't. And we play that role of challenger. My folks sit at the table as these decisions are made. Like I said earlier, again, just bringing that perspective of they are the only person primarily thinking about RGM, the rate, the plan, the strategy, etc. And so that's where we have decided to sit. I think, again, we can talk about the pros and cons for us. We felt like this was the right approach. And then on the KPIs front, we began on the left, on that project tracking side. And my kind of suggestion to all of you is I think if you don't start there, you have to be really clear on how you influence the macro space. Because in the early days, it's really hard to unwind if you do this well. SRM, RGM benefit from just regular business benefit, and you set yourself up to just bicker in unconstructive ways on who's doing what, how does it work? And so for that reason, we ended up on the left side to start, and it worked fine. But we are evolving to the right. And what we have done is we're sort of in the middle of that right now, where we're doing a bit of both. But we're on the journey to say, when we are really good at this, this is how the organization changes. The composition of growth looks different. The composition of margin delivery looks different. Measure us here. And every year we get smarter about turning the gears of the org to deliver those. So that's kind of the two forks in the road amongst a few others we debated. Just a couple takeaways as you think about these kinds of things for you. I think, especially on that top side, realignment of responsibilities within an organization is enormous. It is a step change. And so what we have tried to do, instead of biting off a big elephant, we've taken the pieces that make sense and done them piece by piece. What I mean by that is, I think it's very challenging to stand up a new function and declare, these are the 17 things we're going to go own or decide, and off we go. And P.S., that means your job changes in these 16 ways. Your job changes in these 4 ways. Your job changes in these 3 ways. That's hard to do in one shot. And so I think work through that as a change management exercise. How do you start with a simple step, then another simple step, then another, and you build? I think that's a really important thing to think through, is that the change management can be an enabler or a drag if you have not done it effectively. And that leads to that second one. It's not just the change, it's also the communications plan. Don't underestimate, at least we've found that it's really important to over-communicate at both the senior and junior levels. Here's where we are, here's what we're doing, here's why it will help, for 2 reasons. 1, visibility, create that top of mind, okay, this is an important thing we have to go do. And 2, it gets that buy-in. My view, at least, and my predecessor's view was the same. The more hands you have in the pot in this way constructively, the better off the plan gets. And so helping shape that as a collective group is really important. And then third, I mentioned this at the top, I really believe your structure needs to reflect your organization structure, your culture, and the priorities that exist. I give you the choices we're making. I think they fit Nestle. They may not fit you. And so I would encourage you not to take away, I need to be over here, but instead I need to think through these kinds of things and how they fit to the org that I work for.
Very fascinating. And I've definitely been on some of those project tracking Excels through my consulting time. It's definitely for those transformational processes. Sometimes it's good to be very detail oriented, but as you said, as you scale, it can be quite important to just keep the eye on the prize, have a one North Star metric that matters for everyone, and have that very clear, communicated as well. So yeah, that really resonated with me. In terms of the operating models, you wanted to highlight basically 3 different types here.
Yeah, and this is another fork in the road we had to think about. How do we structure our team? So we just talked about decision-making rights, how we describe value, how we measure, but how do we structure? Where do our people physically sit? Where do they report to? Things like that. And so we debated. I would argue, simplifying, there are 3 kinds of ways you could do this. There's the fully centralized way to start, which says you've got a team, and if you click, Paul, you've got a team that is a distinct, separate from your divisions, that all your folks report to an SRM or RGM leader, and then they go support businesses, but they operate as one team. So the pros of this are you get the strongest RGM expertise, right? That team can serve as a sounding board ecosystem, self-fulfilling acumen build. And then you get those dedicated resources to drive company-wide initiatives. So the benefit of this is if you're trying to drive something like a new KPI or a new process or broad-based promo analytics, it's much easier to do that with a centralized team because you've got the one team that's able to push that into the org. The big downside, though, is that you become least connected to your actual end operators. And so the one kind of fear we had, at least, is if you have this central group, are they really a part of that division team? Because you kind of have to be a part of that team to really be effective. Remember, influence, it's changing how you work, etc. And so you have a pretty high propensity to build silos. It's that kind of consultant model on accident. And so that was kind of the pros and cons we weighed as we thought about that one. You've got this other one that I would call hybrid that says you have a standalone team, but you're matrixed into your businesses. So imagine you've got folks that are jointly accountable both to someone like me centrally and to a division leadership team. You can co-write objectives. They can kind of be in both places, and you figure out how to split time effectively. The pros of that is you get really strong central and division collaboration. So you can do the best of, I think, if you want to push company-wide initiatives, you have that central ability to do so, but you also have that division embeddedness, that seat at the table with a division team, whether that's the LT or the more junior folks building the plans, they're there influencing. Like I said, being that person whose primary focus is good SRM, RGM practices. Some of the cons, though, is it gets really hard to clearly define boundaries. And I think the feedback you'll get from your folks is I feel like I have 2 jobs and I've got 1,000 things I got to do because I've got this whole big central agenda and I feel like I work in this business unit. And so you have to get really clear about what they will do, what they won't do, how they will scale. And this takes effort. And it also takes a little more effort to get buy-in across the businesses because you put yourself in the mind of your BUGM, your business leader, your division leadership team. I'm giving you this resource. They're going to report to me, but I want them to sit on your leadership team, and I want you to help me craft their goals. Okay, well, hold on. Who do they work for, you or me? How does this work? And are they different than the other ones? And you get into this, you kind of have to show a little bit of the power of this. And it just takes a little longer to get that buy-in of, okay, I can see how this really benefits me. And then the last one is the fully decentralized. So the opposite of that left side. So this is where you have a pretty loose structure. Someone like me who sits centrally has maybe dotted line reports in from folks in the businesses. And your RGM experts are directly embedded in the business. So imagine they report to a general manager or to a senior finance leader, and they become a part of those division teams. The pros of this, as you can imagine, you get great internal alignment, right? You do drive some of this adoption faster. You get embedded in division and BU objectives much more quickly, and you're much more closely aligned because you report through them. However, the cons, at least that we perceived, was you have a higher chance to morph into whatever number of operating units you have versus one central team. And so you have a limited ability to develop and maintain core capability, i.e., if you're talking about pricing, remember, at least for us, I remind our folks, Walmart doesn't care if we have 5 operating divisions, 50 or 1. We come to them as one CPG. And PS, they are one retailer. They don't have different stores for our different business units. And so as you think about the language by which we want to go talk to them, we need to figure out how to create that more central approach to these kinds of disciplines. And it just gets harder to do that. Not impossible. You have to be just a bit more energy doing that. And last is there's lower scalability, right? It's harder to share best practices across groups, harder to push broad-based initiatives because, again, you're sort of trying to pluck all the people across the businesses. None is right and none is wrong. I think all have good, solid pros and good, solid things to consider around trade-offs, et cetera. As we think about your business, again, I'll show you in a second where we landed, but I'll kick to Paul. I would just consider, as you think about this, if you haven't already or you are, there is going to be in any one of these 3 a place you're going to have to spend more of your energy. And so I'd make sure you're clear about that and you build that into your own communications and change management plan.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. And I've actually, I'm speaking to a lot of practitioners about this, and there's really ones on each end of the spectrum. One being more entrepreneurial. You have the BU that has their own kind of a business GM mindset, that as they call it, and then on the centralized end, here in Europe, I see a couple of companies doing that where they know they have all the things in line, but you mentioned there are some cons to that as well. But I wanted to launch a quick poll here again to see where most organizations of our audience here have landed. So of course, you can also not land anywhere if it's not applicable to you, but I wanted to check a little bit and then also discuss with you, Colin, when we reveal where you landed, what we think about where most people land, and what the pros and cons are, and what the diversity is there. So we have about 50% have already replied. Let's get that number up a little bit. I would love to have 70-80% the representative spectrum here of our audience. We need a few more for that. But while we wait for that poll, I was just looking at the chat, and here actually there was an interesting debate about where RGM sits within the org. So does it sit with finance, commercial, marketing? Colin, where does it sit within Nestle, if you can share that?
Yeah, we report through our finance organization.
Okay.
And I'm not here to say that's right for every org. I think it's right for us, because what our finance organization does is it's finance plus strategy. I think for me, the most important thing for good RGM to be is impartial. And so I think it's important that, look, if you were designing from scratch, you probably report straight to your CEO, because that allows you that impartial seat at the table. But that won't be possible, or might not make sense at your business. I think beyond what function, I think it's important to understand where can you be the most impartial. Because part of what I ask my leaders to do is push, be that voice. And if they feel like they can't because they're reporting in a place that doesn't allow that, you've kind of neutered yourself to a certain extent. So I think it's important to think about where you can be that impartial voice that creates a bit of a seat at the table for your team on an equal footing with your finance leaders, your sales leaders, and your marketing leaders.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's very interesting. We could have another webinar on that, but I'll share the poll results instead and let me know what you think. So we see a bit almost like a normal distribution here, where most people end up in the hybrids, and then on the two ends we see about 15 to 20%. Does that surprise you, Colin?
No.
That's also where you guys landed, if we can reveal that, right? And
yes.
Why do you think that is? Is that because you need to strike that balance between central and business units, and either one on the sides can be a bit biased towards their own kind of view, or what do you think the reason is why there's so many up for the middle?
Yeah, I think especially if you think about the composition of folks on this phone, Paul, you have a lot of folks that work at bigger organizations, which I would assume means they have multiple operating units. And I think in any organization where you have multiple operating units, you should strongly consider this hybrid approach. Because if you're either left or right, you do have one blind spot you've created that's pretty challenging to overcome. And so if you think about us, we actually started on the left. Right, in 2020, we operated on this left side, and I think that was actually right for us, because what it allowed us to do is build the capability ourselves. It would have been challenging to come into hybrid in step one, because we wouldn't have had some of that foundational work done to allow us to be effective. It's almost like saying, I want that seat at the table, but give me a year to figure out what it means to sit there. And I think we needed that time to be able to make sure we could sit at that seat and earn it. And then you graduate to that hybrid model where, to me, this was, for us at least, the pros were way outweighing the cons. It was really important we have that strong, both central ability to push initiatives through the org and division collaborated structure to allow us to just meet folks where they are, drive value, and make that incremental step forward that is different in Division 1 versus Division 2, BU3 versus BU4. That said, the couple things that I have learned, maybe places I've stubbed my toe or banged a head against a wall, is that clearly defined boundaries. I think the watch out here is you will create a world, if you aren't careful, where you design a role that looks like your people are all magical unicorns, that they can do all the things all right away. And that becomes really hard. And so I think it's really important to, as you get into this hybrid, be clear about here's where we are in the journey. Here's the things we're really going to do, and we're going to step our way to excellence over the course of time, versus trying to level set or try to not level set with, hey, here's where we are, here's step 3, here's step 4, and you create a bit of mismanaged expectation.
Yeah, love that. And that really relates to the point you mentioned earlier about kind of knowing where the ends of the responsibilities are, but also why we're doing what with what person, right? I think that's fleshed out throughout the process. And like that you said, you were also on a spectrum there. You're shifting more towards the hybrid approach. So that's quite fascinating. I see a lot of questions in the chat. We'll get to them at the end of the webinar. I think we have another 10 minutes on the clock here, but wanted to get through more of the content here as well, talking about what's within the RGM function, which layers does it have?
Yeah, and so for us, just going one step deeper, and again, I think you structure how it works for your business. I have 3 groups underneath me. The first is that set of division embedded teams, right? Accountable to business team objectives. They sit physically, they spend some time with their division teams, some time with us. So it's really that hybrid model brought to life. And then we have 2 teams that support that group. One is an end-to-end analytics group. So think of this as the team that brings together all those disparate analytics around price, promo, pack mix, et cetera, into one solution, one harmonized, simple to use, it talks to itself kind of structure. We're on that journey now. And this team for us includes internal dedicated data science folks. And so we build a lot of our own analytics. And we partner with smart firms to help us get smarter. But our model is, as we can, try to build and then buy where it makes sense. And then we also have dedicated teams that support tools underneath this. We are not in the business of designing some report and letting it sit. We're in the business of designing tools that add value and constantly evolving. And that takes dedicated people, time, effort. And then last is a very small group that again, I've harped a few times on the importance of the change management approach. So I have a small dedicated team working on just this. So they're responsible for how do we really connect into the org? How do we go build acumen across our own team, our organization, and all the change management to support that? And you can see how our team is roughly structured around the physical heads that support that.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. And I had a question here from Maria, who was asking, how do you define local revenue management within the global structure? I guess you could think that there's some overlap if we have an RGM function that is both centrally, but also in the divisions. Can you answer that, Maria?
Yeah, and think of us as just in the US. So set aside global Nestle for a sec. Other markets have similar groups that do similar things. We do not yet, and I'm not sure we ever will, have one central global SRM group with people that report into each business, only because the markets are so different, right? Every market across this world and every major geography is different, and so it requires different things. So we are very US localized, if that's the question. Now, I have counterparts I keep in touch with and contact with in both our global groups and across other markets. We're swapping practices, things like that, but our focus is US.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. I think we had, you mentioned here the percentage of the headcounts. Someone asking here in the chat if you want to share the size of your team in the US.
Yeah, my direct team is about, what's that?
Can you give us a ballpark of how big it is?
Yeah, my direct team is about 25, and we have another probably 15 or so that support us through those other 2, the analytics and COE side. I think the data science people, the IT data folks, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Quite a big team. You also wanted to talk a little bit about the KPI journey, so how we measure success. We mentioned it in the beginning, but there's basically 2 models that you guys looked at Nestle USA.
Yeah, and I think this is really important. We talked about, I believe that we need to get on to the journey of macro KPI measurement. For us, the way I talk about this really simply is we are here to support and enable the broader company objectives, the what, right? Every company is after the same couple things: delight my consumer more and more and more, drive top line, drive good bottom line management, support my retailers, support my consumers. We will not change that. We should not. What we are after is how we go about doing that, the composition of growth and the composition of margin, driving good solid rate into our plans, good solid margin management into our plans, etc. And so the way we're working through measuring that is in good solid rate building practices. Are you driving more volume into the market every year? Physical volume, kilograms, ounces, whatever that might be for your market. And are you able to command a slight premium every year on that? Drive more value. That's got to be paired to more consumer willingness to pay, more value you're generating, et cetera, and you're reinvesting that behind your brands and business. To do that, there are a couple ways to think about how you rally the org around that. On the left-hand side, you have what I'd call the stoplight logic, which is you just have a series of metrics that say I'm either doing it or I'm not, red or green. And on the right side, you have more of that strategy document. You've got the right set of metrics, but they are not necessarily black and white objective. They are does your pricing strategy reflect what it needs to be? Are your brands positioned as they should be? Are you positioned against your competitors effectively? And you can imagine there's a bit of a strategy component against that. And so we're doing a bit of both. There's some power in that very simple, are you green or red? But there's, I think, immense power in the strategy side. Does each of your promotional price, pack, mix levers work hard enough for you? And we're able to define what that means, but how that comes to life is a conversation. As an example, hey, I need promotion to work for me really hard on this business. It means I need to have this sort of efficiency number, this sort of response number, and this sort of investment number. And I manage to those. But those numbers might be different for business one versus business two. And so it's a combination of that discussion and then the document that manages. We're doing a little bit of both, but my aim is over time to move towards the right in service of those one or two macro KPIs we're pushing. Again, just to watch out for you, I think it's really important in the early days to make sure you can articulate the value you are driving. But I constantly work to strike a balance of how we articulate why we do what we do along with what we do. And that's what that strategy document allows us to do. Here's why these things make sense. Remember, this journey is as much about change management, communication, changing how you work, as it is the content of what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super fascinating. And I can totally relate to the importance of having a concise metric that is like green or red, but also having the nuance and the so what behind it, if we have an indicator. And I love that you guys are kind of doing a bit of both where possible. Final thoughts and learnings before we get to some questions from the chat.
Yeah, I think for me, simple, fit your structure to your work, right? What works for me will not necessarily work for you. And I think be agile, right? You'll learn as you go. Second, I think really important to match the tools and the analytics to how they will drive value. I've seen a couple of things pop up in the chat around how do you use AI or these things. I think the trap we can easily fall into is to lead ourselves down a path that this is really cool, transformative, and then too far down the road realize I don't really know how to drive this into the business to take an action. And so I think it's really important almost to write that down. What decision am I changing? What value will I drive? And then how does the tool or analytic enable me to do that? And that just allows you to move faster through adoption as you go through. And then last is, to me, I would, at least in the early part, I do both measuring macro KPIs and the dollars. The dollars drives you probably a little crazy, your team's a little crazy, but I do think it's important on the way to the macro KPIs to start thinking through.
That's yeah, great finishing thought here. And I love that you're thinking first principles at each step, right? So what is the question that we need to ask, and why are we doing it? And is generative AI, for instance, as just one example, is that something that actually drives value for the so what that we want to answer in RGM? So yeah, we have a few questions, Colin. I think you inspired a lot of thought here in the chat, and now's the time to ask. So we'll spend some time. I think we have 5 more minutes on the clock, Colin. If we're running over, are you having a hard stop, or can we? Okay, perfect. Then we can engage with the audience here. If you do have a hard stop at what is Central European 3:45, do know that we will send over the recording of this webinar as well. So I think I had an earlier question, which we someone was asking about unified data as a capability and what it took to basically create that for Nestle. It's at the core of most analytics, right?
Yes. Yeah, this was one of the very first things we did. Simple. Bring in your external data, bring your internal data, and harmonize it. I think what we've learned is it's really easy to look at what steady state will be when all the things are harmonized and realize that's like a 10-year journey and almost get paralyzed. I think we had a view of that, maybe like a 60% view, but really we were focused on what's the first thing that has to happen to drive some value and what can we do with it? And then what's the second thing and the third thing? And so I think we took a little bit more of a methodical approach. We're still at this. We have an agile team that does this every cycle for us. New sources, better harmonization, better hierarchy management, et cetera. And I think I view this as a constant evolution, but to me, imperative. It's one of the biggest unlocks is when you create one source of truth, meaning simple things. When this promotion ran 2 weeks ago, how did it perform? And it might sound crazy, but in a lot of our organizations, and you guys know this, you get 5 answers from 5 people. And that's infuriating and debilitating. How do I make a decision? I don't know what happened. And so just the simple process of getting all that stuff in one place and then pointing all the smart brains in your organization to the same place to get one answer way dramatically minimizes the amount of time we look backwards to free our capacity up to look forwards. And so those are the kind of things that we think are on harmonized one data model. But we manage one lake and we push as much stuff into that as we can.
Fascinating. Marcel had an earlier question that popped up in my head when you said this. In terms of revenue management levers, he was asking, do you have dedicated teams for each, or is it something where everyone has to know pricing, pack size, mix, promos? How are you kind of specializing or centralizing that?
Yeah, when we started, we were lever focused. So we had price, pack, promo, mix, dedicated folks, because the whole premise was enable others to do it. So it was about getting the analytics in order and building the right process, et cetera. We are now general. So I have on the CUE analytics side, we have people that own certain pieces of that, but all my division folks manage the full wheel. And so we are empowering them with the tools, the thought process, et cetera, to be able to manage the whole wheel. The rationale is that a business doesn't care about levers. You might action the analytics or the process lever by lever, but at the end of the day, it's one business plan. And so it's important to make sure you can connect them to one category, go into market in one way.
Yeah. Certainly the position that we also take at Buynomics to, it's about, the bottom line at the end of the day, right? Or market share if that's your North Star, but you need to see which levers you pull to get there. And probably doesn't make sense to create more silos, as we just said. It's already hard enough with complexity of business units and functions, etc. But that sounds quite sensible. There was also a question around the future of RGM and digital transformation. You mentioned it in passing, right? But here Xenia is asking, we have AI ChatGPT, we have different tools that already prepare promo plans, pricing simulation. What do you think is the future for kind of the convergence of AI and RGM?
Yeah, I think they're intertwined. My view, though, is that it's really important to understand what is possible and then be able to understand what decisions you can influence now, what actions you can change now, and marry them together. As you think about, take the promotion example you talked about, there's a huge amount of power you can bring to that conversation, but only if you can articulate to a selling individual, a field salesperson, how it helps them make a different decision. As an example, once you're able to look at a promotional plan and you can optimize that plan with real recommendations, that makes a lot of sense to someone. But to do that, you can't just unleash some AI on its own. You have to help train it. How does this retailer go to market? What are the constraints by which we operate? What does the competitive set look like to make them actionable? And so it's this pairing of both good, smart technology with the end operators that must make the decision. And if you do those together, I think you drive meaningful value. If you only do the first one, I think what ends up happening is you build really cool, fancy things that people say, I don't know what to do with that or how to use it.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. And because how do you measure success there, right? Like, what would you say a AI tool that you have implemented? What would constitute success for you, given that it's really about the outcomes at the end of the day?
Why we measure the outcomes. I mean,
Yeah.
take that promo example. This is a great place where you could measure line by line. I changed 15 different events, and the net impact was X and Y. And the how you got there was enabled by some really smart learning algorithm or whatever, AI, math, et cetera, that said, if what I used to do was just look at my plan and look at the events one at a time, what now I've done is feed technology what I'm doing, the rules of the game for me, and allowing it to provide me insights in more real time. And then because of that, I am making different decisions. And the approach that we tend to take, we've just started this, but I like it very much, is we try to find those early adopters that we can turn on those kinds of solutions for, but we require upfront that they are willing to make different decisions. So if I was coming to you, Paul, I wouldn't say, I'm bringing this new thing, good luck, or I'll show you how to use it. I'd say, here's what we're after. What I will be able to provide you is a different way to think about changing your events over time. But what we're going to sign up together for is to drive $1 million of value. So I need you to make some different decisions. And so that reaction you just had forces someone to say, okay, I sort of see it, but now I know I have to do some things. And that's what drives the adoption. Because then once we've done that, now I take that to the next team. Look what has actually happened, not some theoretical exercise, and then off we go.
Yeah, fascinating. So yeah, it's at the end of the day, it's always about the outcomes, right? Like it doesn't change with the tools that we use to get there. It's about how accurate is my forecast, how good is my margin impact, and to some degree, I think from my experience, also about, okay, how can we enable teams? How can we be more efficient with what we're doing and then doing it better as well? We have some more in the Q&A, so you can also use the Q&A function below if you want to ask questions more anonymously. And here someone is asking, speaking of change management, who for you were the stakeholders that facilitated the creation and expansion of RGM, and who were, okay, the blockers? I'm not sure if you want to talk about that, but maybe you can just talk a little bit about the role of stakeholders within that transformational process.
Yeah, look, we have both, just like all of you do. I'm not going to betray functions or like that. I think it's really important to approach this work with an attribution of positive intent. I really believe everybody at Nestle sincerely wants to do good by their consumer, good by their categories, their retailers, and drive results for the business. That said, like with any company, you have folks that this is how I work, get out of my space. You have folks that I just don't believe in different, or, hey, I've been successful before, I don't think I need anything different. You have all that stuff. What we did that I found actually quite useful is we went through a pretty rigorous stakeholder mapping exercise as we talked through what does the organization look like, where are our key influencers, and then you can figure out, based on what you are pushing forward, are these company-wide things, are they small pilots, where do you go? How do you structure to make sure you can talk to people in language that makes sense for them? And if there are certain blockers, maybe they aren't the first people you're going to try to drive value with on a proof of concept or a pilot. Maybe you're going to someone that has more propensity for this. The other thing that I think is really useful is I did a fair amount of sort of listening as I first took this. And I know that in 2020, my predecessor did the same thing. Paul, what are your issues? How can we solve them? Patricia, what are your issues? How can we solve them, etc.? And you can start to then get a sense, you know where you're trying to go. And again, fitting to value and outcome, you can try to fit them on real problems people are trying to solve today. I started this journey trying to think through the big, broad approach. We're going to make a big step at a time. I think there's some value in doing that in spots. But this piece of I'm going to meet the micro moments where they are, use those as proof points, and then scale them, I found is really powerful as well.
I love that. I think you had a very remarkable point in the beginning about the importance of communication. I think we didn't touch upon it that much in this presentation, but at the end of the day, it's all about, not, is it your hybrid model? Do you have COE 10% or 20%? It's really about, what are the goals and how do you get that on the road, basically, right? And that's all through people, and that change management must be really not difficult or challenging, and definitely crucial to the success of this. We could do a whole nother webinar about that. But I'm conscious of time as well. I have one last question from Darko before we go kind of to the end of the session. He's asking how COVID and the following inflation pricing affected the pace of implementation as the right way to do business. Have you felt it was a catalyst for you guys?
Yeah, someone said, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think not that we did that, but look, we took multiple rounds of broad-based pricing as everybody else did, and we used each one of them as an opportunity to push into that good discipline. As a simple example, in the early days, you can pair broad-based pricing action with price strategy review and promo strategy review. Simple things to say, hey, how do you think about the strategy by which you go to market? What does your pricing tell a consumer? And if you're already taking an action, it's much easier to make those sorts of adjustments. So we did that. And then after that, just the way you bring analytics to bear to support both taking and measuring that drives adoption. Oh, I see. That actually was really helpful. I could see how that would work in this other place as well. So 100%, I would call that an accelerator for us. That said, there were certain things that it was limiting for. The last 2 years, as I'm sure has been the case for all of you, have been very volatile from a supply standpoint, from an availability standpoint, from a material cost standpoint. And so that's made thinking about things like good, solid price pack architecture a little harder. So we're working through those. So I think it created opportunities and it's created some challenges for us.
Yeah. That definitely resonates with me personally as well. Thanks everyone for the great session today. One last thing that I want to leave you with, we do have another webinar next week. In 2 weeks actually, on December 1st, about pricing strategy. Thanks so much, Colin. I see everyone in the chat here, Sherry, Viva, Antoine, really thanking you from across the world for these great insights. And hopefully we'll have another session in the future. We have some more expert webinars coming up here at Buynomics. If you want to share your RGM journey, please ping me if maybe we can come together for another one of those webinars. Colin, it's been a great pleasure with you today.
Thanks for having me.
Great, and we'll talk very soon. Everyone have a great weekend, and yeah, thanks for the great insights, Colin.
Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.